Hello and welcome to another sports graphics tutorial with Clutch Creative Designs. Today I'm going to show you how to create a Topps Series 1 2020 baseball card from scratch in Photoshop. Let's get into it. Start a new document. And we're going to put it at 300 resolution. And then 2.5 by 3.5 like a regular baseball card is. I'm going to start off by placing my reference image. Then I'm going to resize that reference image so it fits perfectly. This image was a little bit bigger than the normal size, so I had to resize it and move it around. There we go. Now I'm going to lock that reference layer so we don't mess around with it. And then we're going to start a new layer. Grab the pen tool. And we'll start building out the basic shapes. I always use a color that's different from the original so I can tell how accurate I am. So in this case I used red, and then I just bumped up the stroke to fit it to about the original size. Looks good to me, so now I'm going to make it white. And I'm going to set that fill to white. And then over here by the layers, I'm going to reduce the opacity of the fill. I'm going to move this shape over a little bit so we can compare and contrast to the fill just to make sure it looks as close to the original as possible. So just mess around with it until you think it looks good. And we'll put it back where it was. And now I'm going to use the pen tool again and build out the rest of those shapes. And it's not perfect, so I'm going to press A to select specific vertices and move them around. Here I was just trying to make sure that the angle looked correct. So I just bumped them up a little bit, moved those vertices around a little bit. Trying to get it pixel perfect. And then just play around with that fill again. And then we're going to zoom in here and make another shape. The easiest way to make a rhombus that's accurate is making a rectangle and then taking two of the vertices on the one side and moving them at the same time. Now we have our rhombus shape. And then holding Alt and dragging that shape makes a duplicate. And I'm just modifying it to make sure it looks similar to the original image. On this one, I just selected the ends. You don't want to use Control T and drag it, or it's going to change the angle of the shape. So you just want to use the vertices and move them. And we just selected the red from the original image, and that looks pretty accurate. And I'm just naming my layers, reorganizing them. And I Alt drag again to make a duplicate. And I'm going to line it up to one of the corners. So now that we made a duplicate, we can just Control T and Shift and drag to keep the proportion so that the angle doesn't change. It looks a little bit different from the original image, but I'm not going to mess with the angle on this one since I've already defined what the other shapes angles look like, and I want to keep it all consistent. And then I'm going to make another duplicate, resize it, holding Shift. And moving the vertices. And then we're going to select the color. The stroke color, it looks like a solid dark blue. But the fill looks like a gradient. So we're going to make a gradient. We're going to make sure that the angle is going the correct way. Click on the fill, double click on that white, select the darker part of the gradient in the original image, and then change that black to the other part of the gradient. There we go. Then I'm going to duplicate that rhombus since it's the same exact fill. And we're just going to move this around until we get it to one of the corners, drag it out so that two of the vertices are correct, and then select the two bottom vertices and move them up until it's about accurate. And press Enter. And then I'm going to Alt drag that rhombus again to make another duplicate. We're going to do the same stuff over here, just making sure that the vertices are all lined up with the original. And I'm just moving them around to see if what I made looks accurate. And I'm gonna make this fill a gradient. Just like we did with the blue, we're gonna select the darker part of the gray, and then the lighter part looks like it's white. Rename the layers as appropriate. I like to name my layers based off of what they look like, and I like to organize them. We're going to alt drag that rhombus to make a duplicate and then modify the vertices again. It's a pretty easy design. It's just a lot of duplicating and replicating. And then I'm going to start off the bigger shape with this smaller shape that we duplicated. And I'm just trying to figure out how I want to resize this. Now I'm just going to add vertices and drag them out to where they should go. It's going to look a little funky to start off with, but I'll show you how to fix that. Then we add another vertice and drag that out. And now we just have to adjust the gradient angle. And it looks pretty good. Just making sure that my angles look correct so that they line up. I always like to zoom out just to make sure that everything is looking good. And we just needed to make sure that that big gray rhombus shape, we just needed to make sure that that one big gray gradient shape needed to be on top of the other ones. And it's looking good. And of course, we're going to save our document. We probably should have done that earlier. Don't want to lose any progress. Now we're going to place the Angels logo, resize it to fit it. Press enter when you're done. And I'm going to turn off all the other layers just so I can compare to the original image. The logo's color doesn't look correct. So I'm just going to play around with the hue and saturation. And reduce the saturation a little bit. It was just a little bit too bright. Then I'm going to use the color balance to also fix the colors on the logo, so it looks more red rather than magenta or purple. Now we're looking really good. We're pretty much done. Now I'm just comparing my shapes and layers to the original card. Now we're going to type out the text part. And I'm going to use a font that looks as close as possible to the original, that also has a lot of different varying weights. The weight of the font is how thin or thick the font can be. And as you can see in the card, they use at least 2 or 3 different weights. And I'm just going to play around with the space in between the letters. Then I'm going to duplicate that layer, type in trout, increase the font size, and I'm going to make that a lot thicker. And play around with the spacing in between the letters and resize that. Then I'm going to duplicate the first layer again, type in OF for outfield, and then the separator, and then angels. As you can see, angels is a thicker weight. We're going to resize that. And try to get it as accurate as we can. Then we're going to select all those text layers and turn the color to white. And I'm going to rearrange the layers so that they make sense to me. Then we're going to change trout to red. And I'm going to zoom out. It looks really good. And then go to File, Place. Resize that image to resize the image to your liking. And turn off the layers just to see how it looks like that. Compare it to the original image. And we'll turn ours back on, and it looks very similar. And one thing I noticed in the original cards was there was a slight drop shadow from the shapes that bleeds onto the image. So we're just going to apply that really quick. And I'm just messing with the settings so that it looks right. A lot of times you just have to eyeball it. So we got the inner shadow. Just making some more tweaks. And you don't want to make it too obvious. Subtle changes are always better than major changes. And it looks like I didn't put the stroke on this shape yet, so we're going to fix that. And fix the fill. And then we're going to just alt and drag that effect onto the other layer so that it's the exact same settings. And I'm just going to turn it off, compare it to the original. Turn it all back on in another second. I'm just eyeballing things to make sure that I'm not missing anything. And I'm going to alt drag that effect. And I'm going to just make some more tweaks to this drop shadow. Now I'm going to select all the layers, Control G, and rename that Mike Trout. It's a Mike Trout layer. So you could just duplicate that layer and change it to a different player's name and tweak the settings again. Then on this layer, I'm going to do an outer glow to do a drop shadow kind of all around it. Tweak the settings to my liking. And I'm just comparing the original with my design. I'm going to add a drop shadow to the blue shape. I'm going to drag it to the gray sliver and the other little blue layer. Then I'm going to add an inner shadow just to give it a little bit more depth, like the original card. And I'm just adding some depth to this layer with the inner shadow. But I'm trying to make it as minimal as possible, just like on the card. You don't want to make it too obvious. It's all about subtlety so that people don't notice things that stick out. I'm just comparing, trying to see if there's anything else I missed. And I just needed to drag that logo layer up higher so that it overlaps the other shapes. And let's move this shape down a little bit. And resize it a little bit with the vertices. And then move it below the logo layer. It's looking pretty good. And then I'm going to make the outfield text a little bit lighter. This drop shadow looked a little bit off, so I'm just adjusting it. And I'm just duplicating the drop shadow that I adjusted to the other layers that needed it fixed. This drop shadow just looks like the angle was off by a little bit. Let's compare it one more time. Let's compare it again. The gradient looks a little bit off. I think it needs to be pushed up a little bit more so that there's more gray in it. Same thing with this one. I think the gray just needs to be a little bit more prominent. Just making some tweaks to the inner shadows. And adjusting the angle of the shadow for this one. And this one. Let's compare and contrast again. And we're going to save this image for the web since we're not printing this off. And we're going to do one last look around to make sure that everything looks good, and then we're going to click save.